Okay, so what we're going to work on now is actually creating that pagination that we talked about so that we can actually then paginate the orders that we get back in our section orders table. So I'm going to generate a new component for that with the CLI, just with ng-gc, and we're going to call this simply pagination. And we can go ahead and make a quick commit here too, I think. So we'll just go ahead and git add everything we just added and git commit scaffold pagination component. Okay, so if we look back in our app folder now, we have this pagination directory, and we've got our default files here generated by the Angular CLI. So let's go ahead and take a look directly at the pagination component.typescript file, which is of course pretty empty right now. With this component, we'll add the concept of an output decorator to our pagination component. So we're going to go ahead and import output as well as event emitter here. And we'll also add input, which we've used now in the past. So much in the same way that we use input to specify certain input parameters that we might pass to a child component from a parent component, we'll now look at how we can use output decorators to decorate properties inside of a child component that will then emit some event to their parent component and allow them to consume that event to then take some action. So let's think about the responsibility of our pagination component. We basically want it to store properties for the current page that we're on, say like the total number of pages there are possible, the ability to navigate between a previous and next page, as well as the total count of results. So let's go ahead and start building out some properties for those. And we'll start by thinking about our inputs here. So as you may recall, we can create properties that are decorated with the input decorator by simply using spiral input and then the property name. So for instance, let's create an input for the page and we'll make that a number. Then we'll have an input for the count, also a number. An input of the results per page, let's just call that per page here. Again, a number. We can have an input for the total number of pages to show, which would be a number. And then let's also use an input decorator for a loading property, which we can make a Boolean. And this would be something that we could activate while our page is loading between the times that it's making the request to go get another set of orders as it paginates. So these are the input properties for our component. Let's think about what values that our pagination component might need to output to cause some event on its parent component. So we're going to have a list of pages at the bottom of our table with a previous and next button, and then some number of buttons in between those with numbers on them representing the particular page that we'd like to jump to. So I think we should have a method to go to the previous page, one to go to the next page, and then a button to go to a particular page. And we'll create output decorators for each of those properties. So for the first one, let's call it output go prev for go previous, and we need to bind this to a new event emitter. And we're going to use a Boolean type here to emit. So in order to use our output go previous here, we'll need to bind a new instance of an event emitter to it. And to signify what type of event we're emitting here, we can use TypeScript for that and specify that the type of event here is a Boolean. What we can then do, and let's just build a very simple sample method here to kind of get a feel for what this is doing. But what we can do is create some method here. Let's say like onPrev for onPrevious, which would be just a void type method. We can use our output property here by saying this.goPrev, and then we can call emit on it. So .emit, and let's just go ahead and emit true here. And this will simply emit this event to the parent component. that parent component will then have a specific listener for that event so that it can take some action once it's received. So let's go ahead and wire that up before we get too much further along here with our pagination component. So our pagination component will be a child component within our section orders where we have our table. So let's go ahead and open up its template here. And then after we have our table, we'll go ahead and place in our @pagination. And then the really interesting thing here we can do within our @pagination tag here is to create an event binding. So we're going to name this the same that we named the method that we just defined here in our pagination component. So we have this method onPrev for onPrevious, which simply emits true from our output goPrev here. So if we head back into our section orders component template, and we're going to name this goPrev because it's listening for an event from our goPrev output here, which emits an event, and then we can use it to call some method here in the parent component now. So when this gets received, just simply as a true from the emitter, we'll write a method that will get called from our parent component here to then go to the previous page. So let's just call that method goToPrevious. Now let's simply write our goToPrevious method. So we'll head into our section orders component.ts and we'll scroll down, and let's just confirm that we can get this working by writing a goToPrevious method. And for now we'll just console.log and we'll say previous button clicked. Now back in our pagination component, we can kind of see how this is going to happen. We have this output property goPrevious that is an event emitter. When onPrev is called from within this component, we emit the value true from our output. There's a listener for this in the parent component where our pagination component lives and is a child of. And it's here that we have this sort of event listener for that output. And so when we get true here, we'll call goToPrevious method defined in our parent component. And for now, we've just simply wired it up to log a message out to the console. So now let's head into our pagination component template, which is just the default template for now, and we'll just remove the default pagination works message. And at first, let's just go ahead and wire up a very simple button. So we'll make it a bootstrap button here. And what we'll do is we'll wire up a click event on the button. And we'll have this click event call the onPrev function that we defined in our child pagination component here. And we'll just make the button say previous. I'm just going to go ahead and wrap everything here in a div because we will eventually use this button in the complete template once we've got this all wired up. So let's go ahead and fire up the server very quickly. So we'll just ng serve. Okay, we'll head over into our latest orders, and now we have this previous button. Let's go ahead and open up our inspector. And in the console, we're not currently running our API, so we'll get an error here that we can't connect to the API. That's okay. But if we click previous, we can see we get this message now, previous button clicked. So that's kind of cool. Basically, the event from the component that defines this previous button is bubbling up into the parent component where we are writing a message out to the console here, in this case just saying previous button clicked. So now you can imagine that we could wire up that event to trigger any arbitrary number of actions that we might take to add functionality to our pagination component. Let's wire up a next button now. So if we can just minimize this, we'll go ahead and just copy this. We'll create a new method on next. And let's call this previous page and next page. And then in the TypeScript file, we'll just copy onPrevious. We'll make an onNext method, and we'll need to create a new output property, goNext. And this will also simply emit a Boolean. But now we can bind a different listener for the specific goNext property in our parent component. So if we head over into our section orders component. I'll create a new event binding in the template here called go next, and when this receives the event, we'll create a method go to next, which will be called. So if we go to the TypeScript file for our section orders, go ahead and copy go to previous, and we'll say go to next, and again we can just console log next button clicked for the time being. So if we head back to the page, we can click previous button or next button, and in either case get a different action because of the fact that we are listening to different events here. So that's pretty cool. We'll have a little bit of logic to kind of figure out regarding how to pass down the information from the parent component to the pagination component to understand, what page we're on and how many results there are per page, so that we can then change it in a logical fashion. But it should all be pretty straightforward now that we kind of understand how these output decorators enable us to use event emitters to event some particular message up to a listener in the parent component. So let's go ahead and minimize the browser for now. And let's take a closer look at our section orders component. So we're setting these default values for the page and the total number of records, the total 0, page 1, and limit 10 here. And then when we call ng on init when the component's initialized, we call this.getOrders, where we use our sales data service to get the orders using the API, starting with the first page, pulling back 10 results. That returns an observable that we subscribe to, and when we get a result from that, we set the orders property on our component here with some of that data from the response. Let's go ahead and add a little bit more data here, where we'll say this.total is going to be equal to the response page object, which contains our data, and then we can just call .total. We can also create a loading property and set that to false, because once the response has returned, we are no longer sort of quote unquote loading it. Let's go ahead and create a loading property here as well. And I'm not typing it here because of the fact that it's implied by the default value that we set. So for instance, if I type it here, I'll even get a little TypeScript linter warning that I don't need to actually type these inferred properties when we set a value on them. So basically TypeScript is saying that it's obvious that this is a bool if I'm setting the property to false. So now let's make our goToPrevious method a little bit more useful. What we can do is we'll comment out the console.log for now. And what we can do is simply decrement the page. So we can say this.page minus minus to decrease its value by 1. That way, if we're on, say, page 3, when we call previous, and the page will then go down to 2, and then down to 1, etc. Now, when we're on page 1, we will set it up in the template so that the button will actually be disabled and we won't be able to call goToPrevious. Okay, so that's great. All we've done now is change the property. Once the property's changed, we then need to call getOrders again. This time it will pass it the new updated page, and in this case it'll still pass it the same limit. So we can simply call this.getOrders. So now you can imagine what our goToNext method will look like. So it will be this.page++. And then once again calling getOrders, which will call getOrders from our service using the updated value for page. So we've defined goToPrevious, goToNext. So now let's just go ahead and create our third and final method that we need to define here, which would just be goToPage. Again, a void method. This time though, we'll take in a number n, and we'll write a method to go to that specific page. So we can just simply set this.page to n and then call this.getOrders. This will provide us with the functionality with going to a specific page when in our pagination component we list out like a list of page numbers in between the go and previous button. Okay, so then back in our section orders component template, we created listeners for go previous and go next. Let's go ahead and create a listener for go page, which will go to a specific page. And this time we'll invoke our new goToPage method. And you might be wondering, how will we get the number from that particular event? After all, when we had events for goPrevious and goNext to listen to, they were Booleans, and so they were simply just passing up true, allowing us to just call these methods. Well, we have the sort of event message payload that we can use, and we can pass it with $event. So our emitter will actually pass up a number, and it will get received here by our goToPage method. Okay, so that's all good, but now you may be asking, well, how will our pagination component know what page we're displaying here from the parent component? And that's specifically why we'll be using some input properties on our pagination component. So we'll have 3 of those. We'll have, if you recall, the page input, which will simply be passed the current page from our parent component here, our per page input, and if you recall, that property in the parent here was named limit, and then we had an input count, which was stored on a property total here in our parent component. So just to double check that, here in our section orders parent component, we've got the total results, we've got the page we're on, the limit, in other words, how many per page, and we also had this loading property, and of course the list of orders. So we are going to provide as input to the pagination component all the data that it needs to understand and sort of track what data it needs to query for. Okay, so that's pretty cool. Now we can head into our pagination component. We have those inputs here, the page count and per page that it will receive. We've got our onPrevious and onNext methods that emit events. And now we can create our third output decorated property here with, we'll just say goPage. And as you recall, now we need to actually emit a number. And we'll gain access to this number in the listener, again using the $event syntax, as you see here. Okay, so back in our pagination component, we'll create our third method to go to a specific page, and so we'll call that onPage. Feel free to name these methods differently. The naming might get a little confusing here, but we'll simply call goPage to go to a specific page, and instead of emitting true, we'll just emit a number, which in this case will be n, something that we pass on page here. All right, so now let's think about how we can get some more information out of the inputs that we have. So we could calculate the total pages. With a method, we'll return a number here that we can use in our template. The total pages will be basically the count divided by the number per page. And we could have a remainder. So we'll simply use math.ceil for that to get the ceiling of this.count divided by this.per page. And if we don't get any results, then we can say or 0 here. We can also wire up some logic to determine if we are on the last page. That might be useful for when we are trying to disable the next button, for instance. And so let's create an isLastPage method, which will be a Boolean. And here, if you think about it, we can determine if we're on the last page if we take the total number of results per page, multiply it by the current page, and if that's greater than the total count of records, then we're definitely on the last page. So we can return this.per page multiplied by this.page, in other words, the page that we're on. And if that's greater than this.count, then isLastPage is true. And I just need to fix a typo here with this.count. And we'll make this greater than or equal to. So in other words, if we got, let's say, 50 results back from the database, we had 10 results per page, and let's say we were on the 5th page, then this.per page would be 10, this.page would be 5, which would be 50, which is equal to the count, in other words, the total number that we get back, which is 50. And if we were on page 5 there, then we would be on the last page. Likewise, if we were on page 2, then we would have 20 on the left side here, which is less than the 50 that is in our count, and so we'd get false. In other words, we wouldn't be on the last page. So before we make this any more complicated, let's head over into our pagination component template, and we'll style it up a bit, and then we'll start our API and test it out. So I'm going to create a div class of pages here. I'm going to create a span to hold a message of our page counts. So we'll call the class page counts. And we'll just for now put a placeholder here, but we'll complete this once we actually confirm that our pagination is working. So we could say like X through Y of Z pages, or in our case, orders. Okay, and then we can create another span here, which could be our page totals. And what we'll use here is some interpolation, but we'll just call our total pages method that we just wrote. Okay, then we have our previous and next buttons. And you can imagine in between these buttons, eventually, in just a few moments here, we will have an ng for loop of buttons for the various page numbers that we could click, and we'll need to write a method to kind of update those dynamically as we change pages. But we'll worry about all that in just a moment here. I'd like to go ahead and start up the web API back up and then confirm that our pagination functionality is starting to work. So I'm going to make a commit here. So I'll just open up a new command line. We'll just say start pagination component. Now I'm going to open up a new command line and we'll cd into our web API project. And here we'll just .NET run. This will spin up our API on port 5000 or whatever port was configured when you built your app. So now that our API is running, we don't need to open up the browser and query it. We just need it to be running for our getOrders method to be able to return some results to us within our Angular app. So I'll just head back over into our terminal for the Angular project, minimize it for now. Go ahead and start your Angular project if it's not currently running, and we'll head back into our the browser to visit our Angular app. Okay, so go ahead and refresh the page, and if you click previous or next here, you can see that we can now cycle through the orders that we're displaying on the page. So we've got some basic pagination hooked up. We'll need to apply some styling here to our pagination component, as well as finish it by providing buttons for the various pages that we could jump to, but it is more or less working here. Now I see that we're not getting an order fulfilled value back in the fourth column here. And while some of the order fulfilled should be null, they shouldn't all be null. So let's just confirm that we have the right property name set here. So let's take a look back in our code, and I'm going to head into our section order component here and scroll down a bit. And when we subscribe to the result, I'm also just going to console.log it out. And so I'll just uncomment these lines here, and we can check the name of that property that's getting passed back from our result. So we can see it here. I'll expand it, and it's in page data. And yeah, so you can see that the property that's getting sent back is completed, not fulfilled. So let's go ahead and change the property name here in our component. So I'm going to minimize, and we'll head into our section orders component, and we'll scroll down. And what we're looking for is this order completed here, not fulfilled. Okay, so if we revisit our page now and scroll forward a few, we can now see we have the actual values for order fulfilled for some of the orders that have been fulfilled. And the reason there are a few pages in is because we've ordered our data at the API level by order placed descending. So we have the most recent orders first, all which fall within the specified window that we had defined in the API for our sort of lead time when we were generating the mock data for our database. And so you can see now that the order fulfilled values are indeed displaying on the page because we have the correct name for them now. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and make a commit for that as well. And we'll just say correct property name, and I'm just going to say fulfilled completed. Okay. In the next video, we will look at actually tidying up the pagination component and putting numbers between our previous and next page buttons that we can then use to jump between pages.